In this lesson, I want to talk to you about meter. Meter is how we feel the pulse of music and how we keep track of the notes and the rhythms in a typical notation system. So if I were to use the most common meter, or time signature is another word for that, I'm going to use 4/4. Now many of you have probably heard this term 4/4, and one of the things we want to try to avoid is putting a fraction line, because we're not in math, and so generally in music we don't actually use a fraction line. All we do is stack two numbers on top of each other. Now the top number means something specific, and it's different than the bottom number. The top number means how many, and the bottom number means what kind. And this is true for all of our time signatures. In fact, we'll get into more complex time signatures later, and it's always going to be true. So you want to commit this to memory. The top number is how many, in this case 4, and the bottom number is what kind, in this case quarter note. So the 4 on the bottom represents a quarter note. So you could say that in a 4/4 bar, we have 4 quarter notes. Let's take another time signature for an example. One of my favorite time signatures to use is 3/4, because it gives a different type of a feel than 4/4. In fact, when you're using a meter with an odd number on the top, it sometimes is more interesting than just using 4/4, and it kind of feels like a rocking motion, and there's a little bit more energy sometimes in that meter. So we can apply the same questions. The top is how many, which is 3, and the bottom is what kind, and in this case it's still a quarter note, because 4 is always going to represent a quarter note, and that quarter note is going to be what gets the beat. So in this measure, we would have to have 3 quarter notes, or something that makes up 3 quarter notes. So it could be 3, or it could be 6/8 notes, it could be a dotted half note. There's other combinations as well, but it has to add up to 3 ultimately. Now, of course, another time signature that's common is 2/4, and of course that would mean there's 2 quarter notes, 2 for the top and 4 for the bottom in each measure. So if I wrote something in 2/4, it would look something like this: 2 quarter notes, and then we would have a bar line, and then 2 more quarter notes, and maybe I wanted to be super creative, so I did something like this and ended with a half note. And then of course at the very end, we always want to have a double bar line to signify that that's the end of our music. Now oftentimes we call the time signatures with an even number at the bottom, or like 4 basically. When it's divisible by 2, we call that simple meter. The other term would be compound meter. And generally when we see compound meter, we have a number that's divisible by 3. So for example, if we had 6/8, this would be divisible by 3. Now the number on the bottom is not divisible by 3, but the number on top is divisible by 3. So the way we feel 6/8 is in groups of 3. In fact, oftentimes we'll see 3/8 notes beamed together, and if you put 2 groups of those together, that makes a full measure. Another common way to fill up a bar would be to have a dotted quarter note in 6/8. Now some fun meters you can play with would be something like 5/8 or 7/8, or really any type of number. You can have something really interesting on top, like 12/8, and anything with the 8 in the bottom is generally going to be considered compound meter, and we're going to group everything with this idea of 3/8 notes, or the pulse where we're going to feel 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And oftentimes we'll even count all the way up to that top number. So if we're in 6/8, we'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we're in 8/8, we'd count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, actually 8/8 would be considered duple, but if we were in 9/8, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 12/8 again is divisible by 3, so we consider that a compound meter And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And of course, I'm oversimplifying it with all these eighth notes, but there are pieces out there that just use eighth notes. So this could be a typical bar in eighth notes. And this would be all eighth notes. Of course, if this was rhythm, we probably want to modify it some way to make it more interesting, like have the pitches change, or have the articulation change, or have the dynamics change. But you get the idea. Now, let me show you real quick what that looks like on a staff. We want to have the key signature come first. So let's say I were to write in the key of G major, which has 1 sharp. We want to put the key signature first in the treble clef and in the bass clef. And then we want to put the meter or the time signature right after that. So let's pick 3, 4. Now, even though 3, 4 is divisible by 3, the top number 3 is divisible by 3, we consider this a simple meter. It's one of the rare exceptions to the rule. So we're not going to divide everything into groupings of 3/8 notes, and we're going to feel the pulse as if it were in duple, because it is. So oftentimes, a measure in 3/4 will look something like this, with 3 simple quarter notes. Another combination would be 6/8 notes, or you can have a combination of them, like a half note and 2/8 notes, and that would be a successful measure as well. Now, I'm oversimplifying the pitches and just choosing F, but you can choose, or technically F sharp in this key, but you can choose anything that you like. Now, most systems default to 4/4, so if you use a notation software like Noteflight, or if you use Sibelius or Finale, and you just open up a blank piece of staff paper, you're going to get 4/4. Now, there's nothing wrong with 4/4. In fact, I love writing in 4/4. However, just be aware of that, so that if you try to write something in 3/4 and you realize that there's an extra bar, or there's an extra beat rather, then you'll want to make sure that you manually modify the time signature so that you can actually write in the meter that you want. So in 4/4, remember there's going to be 4 full beats, and this could be a combination of quarter notes and half notes, however you like to do that. Now, oftentimes though, we want to emphasize in Western music the 1 and the 3. So beat 1 and beat 3 get emphasized. So when we're writing music, it's generally considered better to accent those. In other words, you don't want to write something that goes against the meter. If you do, then you're contradicting yourself. So you want to pick a meter that fits what you're writing. Oftentimes I'll have students that do something like this, where they'll put a half note in the second part of the bar like this. And by doing that, they're unintentionally accenting the second beat, because they're ignoring or leaving a note blank or empty on the third beat. And so if you do something like this, it's actually technically correct, but because you're accenting beat 2, we just want to be aware that if that's the case, then we're actually going against the meter and creating a different accent pattern. So typically in Western music, again, we want to focus on accenting beats 1 and beat 3. But in jazz, actually, for example, they accent beat 2 and 4. And a lot of pop music will accent on 2 and 4. So if you're at a concert and people start clapping, you can always tell that the classically trained musicians are clapping on 1 and 3. And the jazz musicians are clapping on 2 and 4. It's sometimes interesting, because then you hear claps on all 4 beats based on the conglomeration of everyone clapping together. Now, when you do some of your compositions, for me, what you might want to do is experiment with more complicated meters like 6/8. Again, remember the 6 on the top means how many, and the bottom number means what kind. So our bottom number 8 is going to stand for an eighth note. Remember, our 4 stands for quarter notes. Our 2 is going to stand for a half note. And very rarely we see 1, and that would just stand for a whole note. So you'd have like 4 whole notes in the measure if it was 4/1, or you would have like 2/1, where you'd have 2 whole notes in the measure. Now, those are very rare. We see that sometimes in medieval music and Renaissance music of the 13 and 1400s, but we don't often see that So we tend to stay away from that music or using that if we can. And sometimes in music, like Thomas Adès, who is a living composer out of Great Britain, he will use some interesting meters or numbers of the on the bottom. So you always have to remember that the bottom number is what divides the whole note. So if the whole note is divided with an 8, that means it's divided 8 times. And that's why we would get the 8th note. Now, if we use something a little bit more complex, like let's say we wanted to use something that's not 1, 2, 4, or 8, which is our most common ones, we could actually divide the whole note by 6. Now this is super rare, so if this is confusing, you can skip this part of the video. But if we were to put a 6 on the bottom, like let's say we would do 4, 6, that would be super advanced and super rare. I've actually used this in my pieces a few times, and composers like Thomas Adès use this, and it's kind of fun because it gives you a triplet feel. So what this means is you're actually taking the whole note and you're dividing it by 6. So you've got the top slice like this, and then you've got the bottom slice like that. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the whole note is divisible by 6. So you're actually feeling it as if it were a triplet feel. So if we were to use 4, 6 in the context here of a grand staff, that means that I'm allowing 4 for the how many and 6 for the what kind. So I'd have to put 4 note heads like that, 4 quarter notes, but they would get a triplet feel. So if our tempo was like this, we'd have 1, 2, 3, 4. And that would actually feel like a triplet in the right context. So oftentimes, what I would do to exploit that, and sometimes what Thomas Adès does as well, is he'll actually switch between, because honestly, if you do a 4/6 bar out of context, it feels just like 4/4. So if we were to have 4 quarter notes in 4/4 time, and 4/6 notes out of context, or in context rather, like this, and you switch measures, then what you would get is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And so this middle measure of 4/6 actually feels like you're speeding up because it feels like a triplet. However, there's 4 notes instead of 3. So in case you wanted to actually expand a triplet, this is one trick that we can use to get that triplet feel. And we can really expand the top note to anything that we want. So if we wanted to put an 8 there, we could put twice as many quarter notes, and then it would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4. Though if that were your case, if that was the case, I would probably just keep it as 4/6 and then create 2 measures. So just like in math, there are multiple ways to accomplish the same goal. So your goal is to figure out the best and most clear and concise way to notate your music so that, again, you can tell people or pass it on to somebody else so that somebody else can play your music. Now, I encourage all of you to use some of these meters. If you're brand new at this, I would encourage you to start with 4/4, and then you can go on to some meters like 3/4 and 6/8. But ultimately, I encourage you to really experiment and try to get to 12/8 and some other complex meters. Well, that's it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for watching.